Yeah, I mean, it's safe to say this is not the NATO summit that European leaders wanted. They were hoping that they were going to be getting a calm Trump coming to Ankara. That is what we're told. That White House officials were briefing, that he was going to come in more conciliatory. Well, that's out the window now, as we just saw in that press conference, and also in his remarks yesterday. Already, immediately upon arriving at the NATO summit, Trump started reigniting his threats to Greenland, saying that Greenland should not be part of Denmark, it should be part of the United States, again criticizing allies for not joining his war on Iran. And of course, the flare-up overnight in that war is terrible news for the European leaders there at NATO, because it makes this subject, which clearly makes President Trump very angry, reignited. So we just heard in that press conference, he went through a litany of the countries he was complaining about. It was very interesting to me. He did not mention a single European leader by name. He kept referring to their countries, even when he was criticizing Spain very intensely. Not one mention of Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, just kept referring to talking to France, talking to Spain. Interesting why he would have made that choice. But this is obviously going to be an awkward meeting. It's going to be very short, less than 3 hours. Just like last year's summit, they're trying to keep the time short to reduce the potential for any flare-ups, any outbursts from Donald Trump. But what we're now going to be watching for is that press conference at the end of the day from President Trump to see if he reignites these attacks on the European allies within NATO.
Dave, European nations, I mean, they have been scrambling, haven't they, to allocate more funding for defence. A load of new deals have been announced. Will it be enough, though?
Yeah, the European countries were really hoping that these announcements of $54 billion of new defense investments at this summit were going to placate President Trump. He hasn't even mentioned that increase of spending. It clearly hasn't registered with him, which has provoked a lot of frustration on the part of European diplomats there in Ankara, who have been telling media, look, we did everything the U.S. asked. The issue is, of course, they're increasing spending immensely. They've agreed to this 5% of GDP target, 3.5% military, and the rest in adjacent spending at last year's NATO summit. But the issue is, of course, that they're making all this additional spending, but they're not actually changing the command and control structure. So if Europe was attacked, they are still reliant on the United States. No matter how much they spend, no matter how much American military equipment they buy, they're still reliant on a NATO command and control structure that relies on the United States. And that's what's not changing. So, we keep seeing at these NATO summits that the European countries are very keen to talk about how much additional spending they're making, trying to placate Trump. It doesn't seem to be registering with him. He's unilaterally focused on Europe, not
Dave, we're going to
joining
interrupt
his
you
war
because we're
on
going to go
Iran,
back to hear
not
more
giving
from
him
Donald
Greenland.
Trump. Apologies, we're going to interrupt to hear more from Donald Trump.
Rational, good people. Most of them. I don't like a couple of them, to be honest with you. But there are a couple I don't like much. But I like Erdogan. I'll tell you, I like President Erdogan. He rolled out the red carpet. He's terrific. He could have gone into the war. A lot of people saying, like with Bibi, I like Bibi. I think Bibi was a terrific wartime prime minister. But Bibi said rough things yesterday about Turkey and Erdogan. And I said, I spoke to him. I said, he could have gone into the war because he doesn't like Israel much. And he doesn't like Bibi much. And he didn't go because of me. And this is a military power. Millions of soldiers. Turkey is very strong. They have a lot of our best equipment. They're trying to get the F-35s. But he didn't go in. He wanted it. He would go in. If it weren't for me, he would have gone in. And he would have been on the other side. Even though I don't think he likes the other side either, because he happens to be very sane and they happen to be very crazy. But so I think, they treated us right. I think China treated us right. I was with President Xi and I said, I hope you're not going to go into the war because we don't want that. He gets 50% of his oil from the Strait of Hormuz, and he gets more than 50%. And he never went into the war. He didn't supply him equipment. He was great. I'm a big fan of President Xi. A lot of people say, oh, why? I watched a couple of people critical of the fact that TikTok, it's so bad, it's so dangerous, it's so horrible, they're spreading all these rumors. And the numbers came out yesterday. You know who's number one on TikTok? I am. I'm number one on TikTok. And all I talk about is how bad communism is, right? They say, oh, it's terrible, they're spreading, but I'm number one. And I listen to Gordon Chang. I like Gordon Chang, but he's always like negative. Oh, China's so terrible, they're so terrible. And TikTok is so terrible. But I'm #1 on TikTok. I have like 4 billion views or something like that. So I don't know. People have to get their priorities straight. We have had a really good day. We're going to have another good half a day. And then I'll see you later. We'll talk to you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, press. Thanks, guys.
I also will do a press.
Thank you, guys.
It will be more
Thank
important.
you, guys. Thank you. Thank you. Please head out this way.
Hey guys, out the door. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Dave, we were talking just before about European nations and how they might respond to this. I mean, the main headline, I suppose, coming out from Donald Trump there was about the Iran ceasefire being over. No mention that we heard, anyway, of Ukraine.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it looks like it's going to be all day of this. I think it's pretty clear. This is a NATO summit off the rails. This is going to be a rocky ride this afternoon. It's true. He has not mentioned Ukraine. There will be a meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky today. Of course, there's going to be renewed concerns about a flare-up between President Trump and President Zelensky, like we saw in the Oval Office last year. The one mention he made of Ukraine yesterday when he came in was saying that what happens in Ukraine is of no concern to the United States, doesn't impact the United States. That's obviously going to be very discouraging for the European allies who are still desperate for the U.S. not to completely pull support for Ukraine. The U.S. has pulled most of its support for Ukraine. Almost all of the financial support for Ukraine is now coming from the European members of NATO and the European Union. But there is still critical intelligence sharing that the U.S. is giving to Ukraine that the Europeans are still worried that President Trump is going to pull. So that meeting with President Zelensky is another potential flashpoint. Of course, then there's also the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who he has had this flare-up with over the past weeks. He was asked about her yesterday when he came in. He didn't really take the bait. He kind of seemed to want to de-escalate in his conflict with her. So we'll see. I mean, there's all kinds of potential flare-ups that can happen this afternoon between Trump and various European leaders. So we'll see where the day goes. And then, of course, you have the unfolding developments in Iran unfolding throughout the day, hanging over the entire summit.